Douglas Macgregor is a retired and decorated U.S. Army colonel, government official, author, consultant, and political commentator. He is perhaps the most effective tank commander in modern history. Macgregor made his mark on history in the Battle of 73 Easting in the First Gulf War in 1991, where he led a unit with 19 tanks that destroyed almost 70 enemy tanks and trucks in just 23 minutes, with no casualties on his side. Colonel Macgregor has since written several insightful books that have impacted military thinkers worldwide. In this interview, he is directly addressing the politicians and decision-makers in Sweden.
And as you know, Sweden has joined NATO, and we are the Swedish government are about to also sign an agreement called the DCA treaty or agreement. And my first question is simply, what does the combination of a NATO membership and the DCA agreement entail for the security of Sweden? And may this combination of commitments and concessions be misused by any power that wish to conquer Russia?
Many people like me who have seen Sweden over many, many years in the international system were quite astonished at the suddenness and speed with which the Swedish government committed itself to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and then ultimately to sign a status of forces agreement with us. It was almost as though everyone was convinced that there were massive Russian forces in the Baltic region in northern Russia poised to invade and march west into Sweden. I've never seen any evidence for that. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I don't know why people have reached these conclusions. The Swedes would do themselves a favor by seriously questioning what they're being told about Russia. I think that's the first and most important issue. Russia, whatever it is not the Soviet Union. Russia has no interest in going to war with NATO or Europe for that matter. Russia never wanted this war and was goaded into it primarily by Washington. And that's something that the Swedes don't seem to understand. They've been listening to an utterly false and fictitious narrative. We're the ones who were pressing for Ukraine's membership in NATO, unnecessarily, by the way. When I was at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, serving under the four-star, American four-star, who was the Supreme Commander of Europe, as well as the German four-star, who was the Chief of Staff, and the Deputy four-star to the American four-star, who was British, I would tell you that the conventional view of Ukraine was that Ukraine was performing a valuable mission by putting several hundred miles between NATO and the Russian military establishment, even though we did not view Russia by any means as a direct or imminent threat. But we saw great value in NATO sitting quiet, or Ukraine sitting in a neutral position between NATO and Russia. All of a sudden now we've convinced ourselves that Russia is hell-bent to conquer the Baltic states, its former satellite states, and nothing could be further from the truth. If the Russians have learned anything, it's that is an economically losing proposition. There's no profit in it. The people don't want it, and frankly, neither do the Russians. But we caused this coup. It was essentially staged by the CIA and MI6 in Great Britain. We took over the government. We installed our puppets and began massively building up Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians immediately began attacking the so-called breakaway provinces in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, killing people almost on a daily basis. Russians were even more oppressed and subjugated and brutalized under the Ukrainian government than they had been previously. And the situation grew worse. We put our biolabs in. We gave the Ukrainians enormously powerful equipment and weapons. We lavished a great deal of money on them. And keep in mind, this is perhaps certainly in the top 5 globally of corrupt countries. We flooded the country with a lot of cash, which made matters even worse. Ultimately, the Russians sensed very accurately there was an existential threat to Russia growing in Ukraine. So they felt compelled to intervene. They tried very hard to reach an agreement with us. to come to some sort of understanding about conventional forces in the region, how much there would be and when and so forth. We rejected everything that they mentioned and essentially told them they had a choice. They could capitulate to our demands, or they could essentially find themselves at war with us. Ultimately, the situation in Ukraine was so dangerous, the Russians intervened. Now, when they first went in, they used very small forces. The army itself was small. And people were very critical of the Russian conduct of the operation. But President Putin and the leadership in Moscow did not want a direct confrontation. They were trying to signal the seriousness with which they took our actions in eastern Ukraine. We decided that that was irrelevant to us. We castigated the Russians for being incompetent and so forth. We told the Ukrainians to commit the full brunt of their military power, about 400,000 troops. And the killing began. Ultimately, it didn't go well for the Ukrainians, contrary to popular belief. And by the end of March, beginning of April, in peace talks, there was an agreement in Istanbul, which was ultimately spoiled by us, essentially subverted, which would have brought the war to an end and provided the equal rights for Russian citizens inside Ukraine that the Russians wanted, as well as an end to this platform that we had built in Ukraine as a way to attack Russia. All of that failed. And at this point, President Putin was told by his generals, look, no one is going to negotiate with us. We're going to have to win this militarily. And to do that, we have to build up our military power, substantially expand the ground force. We have to provide it with new equipment, and we must do it over the next 6 to 12 months. So this begins in earnest in the fall of 2022. And certainly by Christmas, January of 2023, you have this rapidly growing and competent Russian force that has established itself in a defensive posture in areas that were overwhelmingly Russian historically and in terms of the population, culture, and language. And the Ukrainians did the Russians a favor by attacking it. Now, the point is that the Russians sat in utter amazement that the Ukrainians would be so stupid as to attack these very, very elaborate and deep defensive works, but they kept it up and eventually bled themselves white in the process. And now at the end of that long period of pointless counterattacks, the Russian forces are now moving slowly but deliberately to the west. Again, there is still a willingness to negotiate, but there's no one for Moscow to talk to. And in the meantime, everyone, I would say the globalist leaders, this ruling elite in Western Europe and in the United States, is pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over the heads of Moscow and the Russian people, accusing them of crimes they've never committed. And the outcome is that there's no room for discussion. And at this point, I don't think there will be any. I think this war will be ended on Russian terms. The question for Sweden is, why did you want to become part of this? Why do Swedes suddenly want to be hostile to Russia when there was no reason to do so? This is not the Soviet Union. This is not an expansionist imperialist power, not by a long shot. Russia's gross domestic product is about the same as the gross domestic product of Texas in the United States. The Russians were not interested in threatening anyone. So why does Sweden now want to join this unambiguously hostile alliance? It sets Sweden up for the potential to be dragged into a war that Washington may well start against Moscow, not the other way around. So that's really the question I'm asking, is I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. The Finns don't make any sense at all. The Finns were doing a land office business with the Russians. The business is what the Russians want to do. They certainly don't want to go back to the Baltic states and Poland. Good Lord, that's like saying I had smallpox, let's go back and get it again. The Russians aren't stupid. What is the source of all of this? And now the very idea of placing nuclear weapons on Swedish soil is even more lunatic than any other idea I've heard thus far.
Yeah, can I say something there? The Prime Minister of Sweden, he said that it's a question about it's an existential question. It has to do with the future of Europe and Sweden. So he says that Ukraine must win the war. And he also says that Sweden needs American nuclear umbrella for protection and safety. That's how they keep repeating their narrative.
It's stunning to me. The Soviets reached Berlin thanks to our significant help and assistance to them, filled the power vacuum in Central East Europe, and suddenly now Sweden decides to join NATO. I mean, there were certainly good reasons for the Swedes to consider joining NATO in the 50s and early 60s. But why they would want to do it at this point is a mystery to me. The other thing is, suddenly you want nuclear weapons on your soil, ostensibly, on the assumption that the nuclear weapon on your soil protects you. I would argue right now the opposite is the case. If you put a nuclear weapon on Swedish soil, you become an unavoidable target for a Russian nuclear strike if Russia is attacked by us. Now, all of this has to be viewed against the backdrop of a lost war. Haven't people in Sweden figured out that this war is lost? There are over 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. There are more than 1 million casualties. Millions have left Ukraine. Ukraine is a dying nation at this point. It has no chance to win anything. And we are simply subsidizing the puppet regime there to maintain the fiction that we've done something good there, when in fact the opposite is the case. We've cultivated hatred and destruction against Russia. Doesn't make any sense at all, because Russia has not behaved as our enemy. The point is that there are forces at work here that the Swedes need to understand. They need to understand that the globalist ruling class in Europe and the United States is driving this war, and it has failed miserably. Russia has won it. It's now going to be left to Russia to decide what the post-war region looks like. They will draw the new lines, the new territorial arrangements, the new borders, not us. And there's nothing we can do about it. The United States is not the power it was in 1991. We are certainly not going to challenge the Russians in the nuclear sphere. And we do not have the conventional military power to challenge them on a conventional level. Our army is pitifully small. We are having trouble recruiting for our armed forces because, frankly, many Americans don't want to be part of this organization anymore because they don't support the goals and aspirations of the American government, which is completely divorced from the interests of the American people. So Swedes need to stop it and reconsider all of their assumptions. You know, for instance, there are discussions underway in Washington behind closed doors about how we can move more and more, if not all, of our nuclear weapons offshore. We don't want intercontinental ballistic missiles sitting in the ground in the Midwestern United States for the same reason I just mentioned to you. They're simply sitting ducks. They're targets that will attract nuclear attack in the event of a nuclear exchange, which, incidentally, nobody wants. The Russians have made it very clear they will not use a nuclear weapon unless such a weapon is used against them. The Chinese have publicly embraced the no first use doctrine. We should do the same. We haven't done it. In fact, since Biden came to office, he's done the opposite. He's created the dangerous illusion that we might actually fight and win such a nuclear exchange. And that's an impossibility. We know very well that if the Russians and we go to war and use nuclear weapons, 90 million Americans will die in the first hour. Another 90 million will die in the weeks and months afterwards of all sorts of horrible diseases as a result of the radioactivity and the fallout. No one in their right mind is going to use a nuclear weapon. And what is the point of using a nuclear weapon? All it does is destroy everything. The population, the scientific industrial base, anything that may be worth having is ruined. So back to Sweden. What are the Swedes thinking? Why would you want to make yourself a target? Secondly, when Eisenhower was president of the United States, he actually penned a memorandum that is available in the White House, where he had this debate in the 50s when people wanted to put nuclear weapons in Europe. And he said, well, this is a very dumb idea. He said, if we're going to use nuclear weapons, we would want to place them at sea or potentially in North Africa or somewhere in the polar region, but we certainly don't want them inside any of our NATO allies countries. We don't want them inside the United States. Now, we've managed to avoid this insanity of a nuclear exchange, and that's a good thing. But putting nuclear weapons into Sweden right now doesn't help us. It doesn't help the United States. Certainly doesn't help Sweden. So why would the United States want to do a thing like that? And why would Sweden want to surrender its sovereignty, its independence, its freedom of action to us? You know, the third point is we don't live in Europe. Americans live in North America. People don't seem to get that. This is a very important point. Charles de Gaulle said it many, many years ago. You know, the British are an island and the Americans live in North America. They don't live in Europe. They're not Europeans. So why would you place the destiny of your country in the hands of people in Washington? Washington certainly isn't interested in placing its destiny in the hands of Swedes. Why would you want to do it? It just doesn't pass the common sense test. And one last thing, a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement, is something we always establish that ensures that our soldiers, if they commit a crime, will not instantly be tried and convicted and imprisoned in a foreign court. We insist that we must investigate it, try the soldier, and punish him. Now, there are exceptions from time to time because the crime was so heinous. We have made exceptions in Okinawa where some terrible things have been done to the inhabitants there. But on the whole, we tend to insist on maintaining, control of our own troops and the laws that they abide by. Again, I don't understand why you would want to open the floodgates to American military power, aircraft, troops, missiles, rockets, whatever. It just doesn't pass the common sense test.
Thank you for that answer. If Ukraine is finished as a military ramp to attack Russia, if you like, how likely is it that Sweden, Finland may be the new ramp to attack Russia for some other reason, but with the goal to conquer Russia?
Well, that's a legitimate question. I mean, why are we doing what we are doing? Why have we been involved in Ukraine for the last 20 years, trying to turn it into a ticking time bomb for Russia, cultivating hatred and antipathy and opposition to Russia in Ukraine? Why? It makes no sense. Why are we trying to destroy Russia? Well, I don't think Americans have any interest in it at all. But the globalist elite would undoubtedly like to get control of the resources, which are in abundance in Russia. Mineral resources, agricultural resources, and strip Russia of its abundance of natural wealth. I think that's a legitimate question. Why is this happening? And I think that's the answer. It's failed. This is what people need to understand. The war has failed miserably. And at the end of such a horrible contest, where the one side has been so completely and utterly destroyed, which is Ukraine, the humanitarian thing to do is end this war and try to come to some sort of arrangement that meets our security interests as well as Russia's. I don't think that's impossible, particularly when we can agree to neutrality for Ukraine. And that was always the preferred outcome from Russia's standpoint, and it should be from ours. A neutral Ukraine would not have been destroyed. A neutral Ukraine would never have become involved with us and NATO and made itself an instantaneous threat to Russia. So I don't know why the Swedes, the Finns, the Norwegians, the Danes, even though I know they're in NATO, they've all embraced this illogical hatred of Russia, which I just don't buy for a second. I think it's foolish and dangerous, but you've got to debate this inside your parliament. Somebody's got to stand up and say, show us evidence for this imminent threat that justifies American military power on our soil. And then finally, understand the world has changed since the 1950s technologically and warfare dramatically. Now, how has it changed? If there were a major war and it was on the conventional level as opposed to being nuclear, we could not reach you in time to make any difference. We could never cross the Atlantic in time to save anybody because Russian submarines in the Atlantic would sink everything. Land-based missiles would sink everything. I'm not talking about nuclear missiles. I'm talking about conventional warheads. It just wouldn't work. We can't maintain enough forces forward today in order to prevent a rapid Russian offensive if the Russians wanted to unleash it. And I don't see any evidence that they do, far from it. But the point is that that's a huge problem you've got to wrestle with. Then that means that everything has to escalate instantaneously to the nuclear level. Well, that's insane. That brings you back to where we were at the beginning of this thing. You have a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons that belong to us on your soil. Your expectation is that if Sweden is threatened, we will use those nuclear weapons. Will we consult with anyone in Stockholm? What if the Swedish people decide they don't want to be involved in the conflict that we've started? And by the way, if you don't think that's a possibility, all you have to do is look at Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and Libya. We pulled in NATO members into these misguided, self-defeating interventions. What makes you think we will not try to drag you into such interventions? Is the nuclear weapon coming to you for your benefit? I don't think so. I think it's another means of holding together America's control system for vassal states. Why would you want to make yourself a vassal of Greater Washington? It's insane. Makes no sense.
What do you think will happen next if you look forward? Because I read today that Victoria Nuland is back in business, and she says that we need to give weapons so that we can reach deeper into Russia. I mean, if that happens, what could be the game changer if Russia is poked too much?
Well, thus far, President Putin has exercised incredible restraint. And if you go back over the last 3 years, you'll see that President Biden has made a number of public statements about so-called red lines. And he made it clear to people, we will never send modern aircraft. We will never send missiles and rockets with operational range. That is a range of 150 to 300 miles. We will never do this. We will never do this and never do this. And we've crossed all of those red lines. We've violated all the promises that we made ourselves up front. And it's because the war is lost. And sending strike weapons that can reach 300 kilometers across Ukraine into Russia is an exercise in pointless revenge. And the targets the Ukrainians have picked and are still picking are always civilian targets, cities. Objective is to kill Russians, which makes no sense at all. All you have to do is listen to the insane statements coming out of Washington that this war is of great benefit to the United States because Ukrainians are killing Russians. Absurd. We don't benefit from killing Russians, quite the opposite. So I think your question is a legitimate one. At what point does Mr. Putin say the hell with it? I don't know. But I know that right now, the Kinshal and Iskander and other weapon systems can reach virtually every target in Europe, effectively from Bergen in Norway all the way down to southern Portugal. So if the Russians decided to advance against Europe on the assumption that they have no choice because we continue to attack them and refuse to negotiate, I don't know what we can do about it. There is no integrated air and missile defense in NATO. We have no means of stopping the missiles, none whatsoever. The Russians have an integrated air and missile defense system. They probably have the best such a system in the world. They may be the only ones, although the Chinese are trying to build it to protect themselves from us. But we don't have such a thing. And again, the other question you might want to ask is, let's assume that, the Russians are bearing down on you. What makes you think we are going to launch nuclear weapons from North America against Russia? We'll be happy to use the nuclear weapons on your soil and then point to Sweden and say, oh, the Swedes have done this. We haven't. I mean, it's just crazy. The whole thing is absurd. And I don't understand why anyone, the Swedes are well-educated, intelligent people. Why would you do this to yourselves?
Yeah, we have to ask the politicians, and we have to confront them, I think. I wish they could listen to your words here. Do you know the island Gotland in the middle of the Baltic Sea? Yeah.
Yes.
We have some Patriot missiles there for protection. Do you think they could protect Sweden from Russian Kinzhal missiles or the same kind of missiles?
No. The Patriot system is an old system. It's old technology. Some of it has been reworked, but it's still an old system. The technology the Russians are using in many cases, such as the hypersonic missiles, are new. Right now, we have no means to stop a hypersonic missile. We simply can't stop it. Doesn't make any difference what you do. And these hypersonic missiles are proliferating. The Iranians fired hypersonic missiles at targets in Israel. The point of that was to demonstrate that those targets they fired at were very sensitive ones near Israel's nuclear deterrent, if you will. And it was to signal that you can't protect yourselves and we can reach you and destroy you. That's one of the reasons things have come to a screeching halt in terms of the desired war between Israel and Iran, the war that Israel desires. My point to you is, if you're depending on a few batteries of Patriot missiles, good luck. They haven't performed very well in Ukraine.
As you know, we have a Gripen fighter jets, and they said that they might send them down to Ukraine and to educate Ukrainian pilots and so on. And we interviewed a Swedish ex-military pilot, and he said, well, if you start to use them and they are becoming successful, it's possible that Russians will attack the factory of the planes in Sweden. So what do you think?
I think that's accurate. The Gripen is also able to launch the series RBS-15 cruise missiles, the other things that you produce, which are excellent weapon systems. Why would the Russians sit on their hands and let this happen? And I think the Russians have already made this very clear to both the French and the British. Macron has now backed down from his ridiculous statements about committing 20,000 French troops to Ukraine, because it became very clear to him, if you think you can strike at us with impunity and that metropolitan France will not be targeted, you're wrong. The same thing is true for the foolish British. What possible interest do they have in waging war against Russia and Ukraine? None. But they have threatened to turn over very, very dangerous weapon systems like the Storm Shadow and others to the Ukrainians. And the Russians have managed to shoot most of these things down, which is probably fortunate for everyone involved, but there's no guarantee the Russians will not strike targets in Great Britain, ports, airfields, missile installations, factories, same thing in Sweden. But again, this makes no sense. There's no reason for any of this. Why is everyone in Sweden suddenly interested in destroying Russia? Now, I could have understood this after the Treaty of Narva. That's a different matter. That was a different age. And that was a very tragic outcome, in my just estimation, for Western civilization when Sweden lost control of the Baltic littoral. and ultimately subsequently loses control of Karelia. Now, that was then, this is now. We're not dealing with Tsarist Russia. The Russians aren't looking for more territory. They have all the territory they need with all of the resources they could ever want. All they have to do now is effectively exploit them. So where is the evidence that Russia is some sort of dangerous, bloodthirsty juggernaut bent on destroying Scandinavia? I see none.
The only thing we can read in mainstream media about Russia is that it's a bad country and that Putin is a dangerous person, he's a dictator and all that. So we are flooded daily in all the big news channels about how bad and dangerous Russia is. So media is a huge problem. Still, I don't understand myself why people can't look at other sources and think about it. Is this really true? So that's the problem we have.
Well, the United States has more people incarcerated in prisons than any other nation in the world. And that certainly as a proportion of our population, as well as the simple numbers. Does this make us a bad country? You know, we have locked up people involved in January 6th for months and years without proper trial. We suspended habeas corpus. Well, the last time we did that was during the outbreak of the Civil War. And we did it with these people. In one case, a man who was just released was released after it was found that he was picked up simply because he was passing a sign that was a Trump sign over his head to someone in front of him. And that was judged to be a threatening act to the police. Well, then he was incarcerated for, over 100 days for nothing. Now it looks like he's going to be paid $7 million or more in damages, given the false charges under which he was arrested. And by the way, in order to get out, he was advised to plead guilty. Of course, that's subsequently going to be overturned, but the point is that the average American citizen cannot afford to pay for the defense that he or she needs when they're up against the Justice Department. The Ministry of Justice, if you will, in European terms, never runs out of money. So they can bankrupt anyone they want to, with the possible exception of someone like Bill Gates or Elon Musk. So the average American, his or her rights have been ground into the dust. Does this make us a bad country? No, I'm not suggesting that Russia is perfect or it's a model. I don't think we're a model for anybody. I never have. I think that somebody said to me the other day, don't you think the United States is exceptional? I said, yes, it's so exceptional, we can't export it. We should stop.
One last question. What do you think that, two questions. What should the Swedish people do in order to change this situation concerning Swedish safety and so on? And what should the politicians do? Or what shall we do with the politician? Do we have any clues? Because we are kind of clueless within the peace within the peace movement of Sweden.
Yeah, your population has to demand accountability from its elected leaders. So do we. Now, you are in a somewhat stronger position because you have a parliamentary democracy. That means that you can actually cause the government to effectively liquidate itself and start over. In other words, if there's a no confidence vote, you can get a new government. We're stuck as a minimum for 4 years, and there's no choice in the matter for us. We're stuck with that government regardless of what it does. I think I would start asking very hard questions, and frankly, I would threaten my representatives by saying that we will not only not support you in the future, we will never vote for you again unless you hold hearings and you air grievances. This is so important when you are suddenly taking into your country a nuclear weapon that is capable of killing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, of destroying cities. And that is, in fundamental terms, what you're doing. You're allowing that kind of weapon on your soil in the absence of any demonstrated threat to the Swedish people. Only hot air, vacuous allegations, empty accusations that somehow or another Putin is Stalin-like or Hitler-like, which is nonsense. Whatever he is, he's none of those people. Whatever is being said about Russia is probably fundamentally false. So I, as a Swede, I'd be very concerned about that. And I'd say, I want this debated in Parliament. Don't allow some defense minister who's here today and gone tomorrow to sign a document that commits you to accept such things in your country from us. Remember, you take that from us, you also take our control and ultimately our dominance in any decision-making process involving the security of Sweden. You've got to look at what you think you're gaining and measure it by how much you are losing. And I would argue that you're losing your sovereignty. And there's no reason for that.
Okay, thank you very much for your service to peace and normalization. I hope a lot of new people, new listeners will come in and listen to this interview when we air it. And well, thank you again.
Sure, Torbjörn, good luck.
Thank you.
Please visit newsvoice.se and the English section to read articles and watch videos. Don't hesitate to support our work for fact-based peace journalism that seeks to improve international relationships.